Granting herself a moment of reprieve, Shada leaned back in one of the provided armchairs in her and James's shared hotel room, while James was busy rinsing off in the shower for already the third time that day. As she tried to concentrate on the news channel before her, she constantly had to fight off a strange pit that had formed in her stomach, weighing her down, as well as a nagging feeling in the back of her head that incessantly urged her to go and join him. And while taking a shower together with her boyfriend wasn't the strangest thought for her to have, the way how she just couldn't shake the feeling was uncharacteristic of her. In fact, it was getting hard to deny that something was up at this point, and she'd have to do something about it, and probably soon. It was just her luck, really, that they came down here at this time of the year of all times. As soon as James got out of the shower, she'd asked to go for a quick supply run before the stores were shut down for the day, so she could pick up the necessary medications to hopefully keep her head clear, at least whenever they didn't have plenty of time to themselves. But until then, she'd have to keep herself distracted so the more ancient side of her body wouldn't try to take the lead here. It didn't help that the news in the past days had been a near constant rerun of the same ongoing supply chain issues in the area, the cause of which had still not been entirely determined. Admittedly, day to day, the story was slightly changed up by the slow worsening conditions caused by the problem, as well as the gradually building unrest of the affected people. However, the basic premise remained the same, and after seeing it multiple times already without much changing about it, it didn't exactly capture the attention anymore. So, with a noticeable tension building within her, she'd made the executive decision to, for the first time in days, change the channel away from the local news. Flipping channels, she came across the usual advertisements, snippets of random programs, reruns of old series, and more global news cycles, just waiting for her eyes to noticeably hang on to any of it so she could immerse herself for only a moment. And her eyes did, in fact, hang on to some of the programming the higher she ascended in the aired channels. However, those channels were apparently airing content in the spirit of the season, and given that it was the month of months, that specific content wasn't exactly helping any with her current condition, which is why she skipped it as fast as she could. After a few more seconds of uselessly flipping around, as well as a brief moment of suddenly building temptation to stop and check out one of the more spicy programs a bit more closely, she quickly and violently shook out her head, while simultaneously abandoning the channel-changing idea and hastily returning to the boring but much safer local program again. Her eyes still shut tightly from her violent head shaking. She briefly sank backwards and leaned her entire weight against the backrest of the chair, while slowly letting out a long, drawn-out huff. Things were just beginning, and it was already getting this bad. Despite it happening every Dunham a year, she was always surprised just how quickly it overcame her. In her memories, it always seemed more like a slow build-up instead of a one moment to the next occurrence. Maybe it was worse this year since she technically had an available partner, or maybe the stress was amping her up. Or maybe her memories were just a bit sugar-coated and it had been like this every year. In the end, it didn't matter. She just had to get her medication and it wouldn't bother her anymore. At least until the aftermath happened, which she already wasn't looking forward to. Thinking of it, she should probably also stock up on pain medication while she still could. Still, it was hard to imagine that this was what most men, and apparently humans in general as well, always felt like. Although, if this was always there, you probably didn't notice it as much anymore. Like anything, it would likely become muted at some point, only coming through in moments of weakness, to then be preyed upon by establishments like the one just down the street. What a shitty deal for them. Having luckily been thoroughly distracted by the venturing of her own thoughts, she'd finally lifted her head again to see what was happening on the screen now. By now, the typical segment about the shortages has ended, and Sheeta's recently reopened eyes had to do a quick double take as she suddenly looked back at the back of her own head being filmed by a slightly unsteady camera as she trudged after James and a sloppily dressed farmhand along the uneven forest floor of a Shaffian farm not too far from the city. They had visited it the day prior after a courteous invitation from none other than Carfwem, who was the owner of said farm, although he himself did not live there, like would be tradition for the rich and wealthy of Dunham. Instead, he merely let it be run by some of his workers, likely keeping it around just to show that he could, while not really respecting any of the status and utility that came with such properties, that made them so popular among those who could afford them. Just another example of the Pale Man being a rather strange specimen of a Dunham businessman. Not that he wasn't wealthy enough to be able to afford it, but he was still so wasteful. Such a strange man. Despite all that, at least James had had fun with it, asking questions about the way the primates were being held, and interacting with the animals whenever they would come down for the treetops to inspect their visitors. But in the end, it was a rather eventless visit. At least there hadn't been a blunder that the news teams could have spun into a more tantalizing story. They had gone, inspected the place, and left again. Maybe it would get them some points with the locals, since James had clearly been interested in learning about the customs and traditions that went into the breeding and keeping of the animals, but that was all. Not exactly a huge jump in relations. Meanwhile, Fem and his associates, which included large parts of Dunamir's economic structure, were all still basically stonewalling any attempt to negotiate with them, while outwardly keeping up a polite facade that was hard to puncture without a very confrontational approach. One that wouldn't be very beneficial for garnering support in any way, at least not without a plan behind it. As all of this whizzed through her mind, the constant sound of rushing and loudly splashing water from the bathroom finally stopped, and was soon replaced by wet footsteps. It followed the shrieking of a hairdryer, and finally an opening of the door. The clear lack of any rustling of clothes told her that James had walked out while basically not wearing anything, and so she kept her eyes strictly focused on the screen before her, just so her lizard brain wouldn't get any ideas. "We need to go out for a moment later," she informed him, without turning her head in his direction even slightly, only one ear twitching around to show him that she was paying attention. "I need to get something before everything shuts down for the night." From the sounds of it, James froze in the middle of putting his clothes on, likely to now stare at her questioningly. "Seriously?" he asked, with slight disbelief in his voice, and Sheeta could hear his foot hit the floor after he apparently got tired of balancing on one leg while staring at her. "I just washed up." Sheeta sighed, not because of what James said, but because she knew it was an inopportune time herself. Still, the discomfort building up around her core did not exactly seem like it would allow for any delays. "I know, but it's important," she replied earnestly, and trying to get her situation across without appearing whiny. "If you don't want to go, I can just grab one of the guards and be back in a few minutes." She could hear the rustling of his short hair as James apparently shook his head. No, I'll come," he said, and soon he got back to putting his pants on as he spoke. "But mind telling me what we're getting?" She had sighed again. She didn't know what she had expected, but somehow she hadn't planned to exactly go into detail about her current situation, even if that was most likely just wishful thinking on her part. It just felt so suggestive to suddenly bring it up to him. Still, it was beneath her to be all sheepish about it now. "I need some medication," she replied at first, before briefly pausing to think how exactly she should phrase the rest of that sentence. However, that pause alone was enough for James to stop his changing again, and this time he wasn't quite satisfied with standing and staring anymore. With quick steps, he quickly traversed the room, and soon, his image popped up in her periphery. And, of course, he didn't have his shirt on yet. "Why, what's the matter?" he asked, clearly worried, while Sheeta quickly turned her head to not look at him directly. Was she overreacting? Maybe, but she really didn't want that uncomfortable feeling around her stomach to get any more intense. "It's all good," she quickly assured him hastily, and raised her flat hand in his direction to make it clear that she was being serious. "It's all good. I just need something against the heat." "The heat?" James slowly repeated, and his voice made it clear that he was seriously doubting either her honesty or her mental abilities after that unfortunate formulation on her part. It did sound a bit like a bad excuse when put like that. At first, Sheeta wanted to burst out in a quick babble of explanations that likely would have cleared up exactly nothing and caused more confusion in the process. However, despite her hormones going haywire at that point, she managed to take a moment to refocus herself with a controlled breath, and decided that just making it blunt would likely be way more effective than any hasty explanations. "It's mating season," she said, and finally turned to face him, so that the eye contact would hopefully pull him out of his worried state, and back into grounded reality. James stood and looked back on her, his chest uncovered and his pants still open, for a few seconds. "Oh," was all he could finally bring out. Not long after, a polite yet clearly stressed and probably overworked woman, dressed in a simple store uniform, packed the necessary pharmaceuticals in a neat, nondescript white bag. "All right, that should be everything," she informed, scooting the bag over the counter along with one of the typical bioscanners that could be found in almost every shop in the entire community. She then briefly glanced up past Sheeta and towards James, who was awkwardly waiting behind her and pretending to be mightily interested in a label of prominently displayed shampoo that he obviously couldn't actually read, just as much as he didn't understand a word of what the Miet were talking about. "Will you be paying that in UC?" Despite the fact that James was wearing his breath filter, and was otherwise nearly entirely wrapped up as well, the clerk gave him a noticeable once-over as she looked at him, indicating that she was likely dealing with the Bane already. There was also a certain recognition in her eyes, so there was a good chance that she had seen his face, or at least his mask, on the news as well. "Yes, please," Shada replied, and gave the clerk a sympathetic look while the woman quickly made some inputs into the register computer to switch his setting to the Intragalactic Banking Standard. Back in the day, she would have just waited it out quietly to make sure the interaction was over as quickly as possible. However, today the empty air somehow felt heavy as she stood in the quiet room, so Shada inadvertently said the first thing that came to mind just to fill it. "It's a good thing there aren't any shortages for this stuff right now, huh?" The clerk quickly glanced up and raised a single ear, almost surprised that she was being addressed. Still, she was trying to be polite in her workplace, so she replied, "Well, we haven't had any trouble so far, and the cybersecurity of Jigendi Komlatopeno is top-notch, so you shouldn't worry about that, and even if—" The clerk made a noticeable pause and looked past Shada and at James once again, adding a suggestive flick of her ears before she continued, "I'm not so sure you'll be needing it that much." With a roll of her eyes, Shada let out a playful hiss of disapproval, before finally getting the confirming nod of the clerk's head, telling her to lower her hand onto the scanner. The transaction was completed quickly, and Shada swiftly scooped the bag up from the counter before turning to pull James out of the store. She barely waited until they had set foot on the street, before already tearing one of the packages open and quickly swallowing one of the large, plain white pills inside. Although she knew that the medicine would take some time to work in reality, just the knowledge that it would happen soon was already enough to make her feel slightly better, as the bothering feeling around her core started to subside. Although, even with the medicine, she knew it wouldn't completely disappear until the time the month of months was over. However, it would be far more manageable. And with that worry being gone for the moment, and James seemingly still feeling a bit awkward about the whole ordeal, judging by the way he stood quietly and carefully watched how she would react now, it was about time to ease the mood a bit. "Sorry, James. Looks like there won't be any uncontrolled sexy time in your future," she jestingly informed him, with a flick of her ears and her tail quickly swung around to briefly glide along his side, before returning to a steady swing behind her. James laughed dryly for his mask, then shifted to show the outline of a mildly smiling face looking back at her. "I'm more than happy with controlled sexy time," he gave back with awkward humour in his voice, and clearly breathed a bit easier now that they were back to joking. "I'm just glad it was nothing more serious." "Controlled is fine by me," Shada replied, not quite willing to let him off the hook just yet, as she was still egged on by the not-yet-suppressed call of nature. Although if you ever wanted to get wild, you won't get an opportunity like this again anytime soon. James sighed and left his head hanging, but he was smart enough to not answer anything as to not give her any more ammunition for further elaborations on the topic. And Shada was feeling merciful, since she knew she would soon find relief from the nature-bestowed curse raging inside her body at the time, so she did not push it any further either. Only after she had been quiet for long enough for James to be sure that she wasn't going to return to the suggestive talk, did he speak up again. "I bet the people making that stuff make a good living around this time, huh?" he thought aloud, and glanced down at the package with the single pill missing that Shada was still holding in her hand. "Probably," Shada concurred with a nod, as she dropped the package back into the bag with its contemporaries. "Although it's honestly dirt cheap. Makes sense if you consider that people basically need it to keep their heads clear. It would probably dampen productivity quite a bit if half your workers were either constantly distracted by the other half, or worse, took them away to get relief somewhere. Probably not good for business." "Probably," James concurred, with another dry chuckle. Thankfully, it didn't take too long until the medicine could unfold its complete effect, and so Shada was back to near 100% when they arrived back at their room. And now, after having skipped out earlier, as well as having quite felt hot for a while there, it was time for her to also hit the shower. The rushing water of the synthetic, miniature waterfall was a bit loud for her tastes, but at least the near scalding hot water felt rather nice running along her skin. So nice, in fact, that she spent a bit more time standing there and letting herself be doused by the constant stream than may have been strictly necessary. When she was done, Her own footsteps were significantly quieter than those of James as she suddenly traversed the artificial rocky tunnel that led out of the shower and into the bathroom proper. Her ears were still buzzing from the near constant, loud noise of the water, and she tried to quickly get to the hairdryer so her sensitive hearing wouldn't get too used to the absence of noise before she could turn on the screeching device. She already had it in her hand with her finger on the on switch, when suddenly the buzzing in her ears died down enough to allow her to hear the quiet, muffled sound of a voice coming from outside the room. At first she thought it was just the TV again, and wanted to just ignore it. However, she hesitated for just long enough to realize that it wasn't an unfamiliar voice speaking there, making her concentrate more on it. Although it was certainly dampened by the door, her fine ears were able to make out James's voice quite clearly, even as he spoke in a low, strict tone. "I don't know how you got this contact, but if you want to discuss something that is of interest to me, I see no reason for this weak attempt at secrecy," he said, in seemingly no uncertain terms. "As you know, I'm a very public figure, and He paused for a moment, and it seemed like he was listening to someone who had just interrupted although whoever he was talking to was completely inaudible. With her curiosity piqued, Shada quickly grabbed a towel, which she loosely wrapped around herself, and, although she was still dripping wet, opened the door to step out and see what was up with James. At the sound of the door opening, James turned his head in surprise, and he quickly raised a finger to his lips to indicate for her to be quiet, while removing his phone from his ear with his other hand to quickly turn the speaker on so she could listen in. "Discuss the details in private. I know this is unorthodox, and my employer is highly unhappy with this arrangement as well. However, it involves topics that cannot yet be publicly discussed without possibly causing a legal incident. While a private discussion would have no further ramifications for either party, I hope you consider this reason enough to consider this proposition carefully," a high voice informed out of the speaker, speaking politely and professionally, although there was a certain strangeness to it that was hard to categorize. James paused for a moment, his lips shifting from side to side as he looked down at the device in his hand. "And what would I get out of this exchange?" he finally asked, after taking a brief glance up at Sheeta's face. "An ally, Ambassador Aldwin," the voice replied after a moment of consideration. "As you are already aware, your opponents have allies around these parts. It would be good for you if you had some as well. And besides that, I can assure you, my employer has a proposition for you that I am sure you will find most beneficial to both parties." Hearing that, James glanced up at Sheeta again. However, she could do little more than skeptically look at the device as well. That was very little information to work with. James's lips shifted again, and he briefly scratched his temple as his face fell into a picture of near pure insecurity. However, his voice reflected none of that, remaining as low and sturdy as it had been for the entire conversation, as he asked, "If you're so sure about that, why all the secrecy then?" The voice on the other side hesitated for a moment. "I have my reasons," it finally replied. "You are free to decline, of course. I cannot force you to hear me out, or to meet with my employer. However, you should know that your current course of action has very little chance of success. As things currently are, you will not gain the people's support without Kraftwerm's help. However, it does not have to stay that way." James raised an eyebrow, and his posture turned a bit more confident as he straightened up. "And I'm just supposed to believe that?" he asked challengingly into the phone. "Of course not," the voice replied, "but I suspect you are an intelligent man. So, tell me, is your assessment of things any different?" It was a tough question. Kraftwerm had seemed far from cooperative so far. Sheeta honestly didn't have a good answer to that question, and it seemed that neither did James. However, they also couldn't so easily surrender to this strange voice's points. "Well, at the very least you have my curiosity," James replied, deflecting the question to the best of his abilities. "Tell your employer I would be willing to agree to a proper conversation. That is why I came to this planet, after all. However, they should not get too excited. Since they want to be so sparse with the details, I'm gone as soon as I don't like what I'm hearing, so they better not waste my time." Sheeta imagined some sort of relieved breath or maybe chuckle would come from the voice after that. However, nothing of the like happened. It remained perfectly steady as it seemingly happily replied, "Thank you, Ambassador. I promise you will not regret it." "And call my phone next time," James quickly ordered, almost cutting the voice off to make sure that they wouldn't hang up before he got the message out. Still, it was unclear if they had heard it when the connection was finally cut off. Sheeta was slightly confused about that last comment, but looking down at the phone in James's hand, she only now finally noticed that it wasn't his device he had been using to take the call at all. It was hers. Even after the connection was cut, James held the phone in the same position for a good while longer, while looking down at it with his eyebrows raised in a mixture of doubt and uncertainty. And Shida imagined she had much the same look on her face. "How does anyone have my number?" she wondered aloud, and James could only shake his head in reply. "No idea," he said. "I'm sure none of the guys have given it to anybody." Shida agreed with that. It was hard to imagine one of the soldiers just giving up her phone number for no good reason. And if there was a good reason, they would definitely have informed her. "We should probably still talk to them," she said, "just to make sure." Of course, a strange, unknown person calling one of their wards, especially the one who wasn't in the habit of giving out her phone number to possible contacts, didn't exactly sit right with their protective group of soldiers. However, there was little they could do about it. And as someone who had your number wasn't significantly more threatening than someone who didn't in and of itself, there was not yet a reason to really raise the alarms, even if everyone agreed that it was a good indicator, and that they should likely be as careful as possible from here on out. "And if you really want to meet that mystery person, we're going to need to be doubly and triply sure that there's nothing fishy going on." Sam, or as James called her, Athena, commented, with her arms crossed in front of her chest. "Because that sounds like a prime opportunity for an ambush, or something of the like." "Obviously," the Major, or Andres, replied offhandedly, and threw some of his long hair back with a flick of his head. "Although I'm admittedly intrigued. Don't get me wrong, safety comes first of course, but maybe this is something we shouldn't let us pass by." James let out a noticeable exhale and deflated slightly. "So, you think I should go?" he asked, while his foot incessantly tapped the floor as his leg wiggled, seemingly uncontrollably. "I mean, I can look out for myself if it comes to that, but I'm not going to make your job any harder than it needs to be." "Wouldn't it be the first time?" Admir cockily commented, and nudged James from the side rather unprofessionally, which earned him a disapproving look from Sam, who was playing with the pitch-black ring she wore on her middle finger again, rotating it with her ring finger and the tip of her thumb. "Well, it depends on what they tell you when they make contact again," Andres replied to James's inquiry, and thoughtfully brought a finger to his lips, pressing his knuckles against his chin. "But if we can create a scenario where the risk is minimal, I think it'd definitely be worth the shot. After all, it'd be nice to have someone around here who was actually willing to work with us." That much was true enough, at least. "Well, I'm going to trust your expertise there," James mumbled, with a brief nod of his head, while he also brought his finger to his lips in an imitation of his superior. While those four were talking and hashing out the details of how an encounter like that would possibly look, and what sort of safety measures could be taken so that the risk to James would be minimal, Shida's attention was momentarily pulled away from the former team of humans. First Lieutenant Tuya, the only member of the current team of soldiers who did not have a history with James, seemingly excluded herself a bit from the conversation. As everyone wasn't currently on duty, at least not fully, and things were a lot laxer and more casual than they were whenever the team and James stepped outside as ward and bodyguards, the green-haired woman seemingly used the opportunity of everyone being busy to quickly check her own phone. She briefly smirked at the screen, right before quickly typing something with rapid fingers, before subsequently pulling the device back into her pocket. After that, she paid attention again. Shida interestedly tilted her head to the side while watching the odd display. For a moment, the thought crept up on her that she might have just found the very information leak they were wondering about. However, it soon became apparent to her that it was highly doubtful that someone with 2 years' training would make her involvement in something like this so very obvious. Still, it would likely be better to not leave this possibility entirely unexplored, so Shida kept up staring at the lieutenant while slowly scooting ever closer towards her, until Tuya had little choice but to acknowledge her existence and incessant staring. The small metal rod that pierced through one side of her nose twinkled slightly in the light, as she interestedly raised her thin, dark eyebrows. It almost seemed like she tried to wirelessly communicate with Shida, so that the two wouldn't interrupt the ongoing planning next to them. Shida took her up on that, and so she nodded downwards towards the pocket the phone had disappeared into, while raising a single eyebrow and letting one ear hang down herself. For a moment, it didn't seem to click for the woman, as she looked back at Shida with confusedly narrowing eyes and a furrowed brow. Then she glanced down in the same direction Shida had nodded at, and her hand inadvertently reached for the small dent in her pocket where her phone was. Some understanding came over her face for a second. Then she looked back up at Shida. At first, her expression seemed to convey a mixture of disappointment and even anger, as her features hardened and her brow furrowed even more, while her lips pressed tightly together. It seemed she didn't appreciate the possibly implied accusation. However, soon her features got softer again, as her lips relaxed and she raised her eyebrows slightly, giving Shida an evaluating once over before finally nodding and looking almost appreciative, and certainly respectful. Freely and without further prompting, she reached into her pocket and offered the phone up after activating and unlocking it with a single press of her finger. Immediately, the first thing it displayed was an exchange of messages, the last of which was sent only moments prior, which matched up with the observation Shida had made earlier. The feline took a moment to read over the exchange. Despite her newly acquired basic skills in the English language, there were apparently a lot of abbreviations and symbols present in the conversation that Shida didn't quite know how to interpret. However, she understood enough of it to know that it simply had nothing directly to do with what happened with the mystery voice, especially since the last message sent moments prior was one of the few that she could fully understand, as it merely read, "Something happened. Can't talk about it, but James probably will. Maybe you should give him a call soon." Which would have been a rather strange message if addressed to a mystery voice that had, in fact, just gotten done calling James, and was in fact the thing that happened. Some curious looks that their wordless conversation garnered from the group they were trying not to disturb by keeping it wordless, meanwhile informed Shida that their exchange may have been quiet, but it was still far from subtle. And although the planning was not actively interrupted to call them out on it, it would likely be brought up right after, and therefore Shida felt safe in abandoning the topic for a moment. She quickly nodded towards Tuya, indicating that she was satisfied, and that the lieutenant could put her phone away again, now without further suspicion from her side. Not long after, the improvised strategy meeting was concluded, when everyone decided that it was getting a bit late by now, and the bulk of planning would have to wait until they had a bit more information on the way this meeting would take place. Although, as a first line of defense, they had already worked out that it would be best if James and Shida would take advantage of the human tradition to conceal their appearance with breath filters to blend in with the bodyguards, so that a targeted attack on them would be made a lot more difficult. The team of guards also agreed to fill their colleagues in on everything, so James and Shida could take the rest of the night to figure things out on how they personally would like to approach this. After all, they were the ones who would have to do the talking, if it came to that. As soon as they were back in their room, James immediately let out a very long breath, and started to fan himself by repeatedly pulling his shirt away from his chest and letting it fall back down. "So, what were you two ogling about there?" he asked nonchalantly. Straightforward about it, Shida replied, "Thought it was suspicious that she was on her phone. Turns out she was just texting somebody. I don't think we need to worry." James lifted an eyebrow. "Texting who?" he asked with a curious gaze, but Shida could only shrug. "No idea," she said earnestly, although her tone shifted a bit into sly territory as she added, "Although I guess we'll know when you get a call in the near future." James looked even more confused now, but apparently not enough to further ask about it, because he then turned away with somewhat of an audible groan. "Is your stuff working already?" he asked with a look over his shoulder, while he kept up his fanning and quickly wiped away some sweat from his forehead. Shida tilted her head to the side. "Sure is," she replied, and flopped one ear down while the other remained trained at him. "Why, are you getting in the mood all of a sudden?" James amusedly rolled his eyes. "Ha ha," he replied sarcastically, before letting himself fall backwards onto the bed. "I was just wondering if you'd mind if I took my shirt off again. Today is a scorcher." Shida let herself fall onto the bed right next to him, and looked him up and down with a smirk on her face. "Not that I mind that," she informed him with a suggestive tone, before changing her tune to a more humourful one as she added, "But if it's that bad, how about I put a jacket on, and you turn the temperature in here down a bit?" James immediately shot into an upright position, looking down at her with eyes wide open in surprise. "I can do that?" he asked loudly, causing Shida to burst into a bout of sniggering. "Of course you can. What did you think?" She gave back amusedly, and pushed herself up so she'd lean on one elbow on the mattress. "Well, I mean, ever since," James mumbled, before shaking his hand decidedly and ending with, "Never mind. You sure it doesn't bother you?" To that, Shida sat up and wrapped her arms around him tightly, pressing up against him so their body heat would radiate against each other. "I can handle it," she mused, before reaching one hand up to slowly stroke through his short hair with long fingers. "Just don't overdo it and turn this place into the richest south."